What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Behind the Door podcast with the matching Jeremy Hilton, Brandon Brown in our army green beanies because that's how we roll. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to talk about an interesting topic today. I think, to be honest with you, I'm surprised that we haven't really started talking about this, but we're going to talk about how oppressive it is to be in prison and be completely isolated and shut out from intimacy and connection and the opposite sex, and also the same sex. If that's how you roll, it's made like illegal to have intimate relationships while you're in prison, and about kind of the long-term effects of experiencing that disconnection and that isolation from any form of intimacy. And I think this is probably something that's going to take a few episodes, but we were talking about it recently and realized this is something that we really have to talk about because it's a huge problem for people transitioning out of prison. And in some ways, it's like almost a topic that is talked about in the opposite, like all the, quote unquote gay stuff and homosexual stuff that happens in prisons on both sides for men and women, and how it's almost sensationalized, homosexual relationships. But we don't really have a chance to talk about the damage that it does to you when you're in prison for any amount of time, but especially a long time, completely disconnected from, intimacy and relationships, and how hard that is to transition out of once you come home. And so Jeremy, I'm wondering, just for you, like in the time that you've done, how much did that play a role? How hard has it been to transition out of prison with all that isolation into relationships for you coming home?
Well, it's probably been the hardest piece of my life is relationships and getting close to people and trusting people and seeing it. I think just the fact that you're isolated, like you were saying, like you get isolated, and then you get cut off from relationships, and while you're incarcerated, things there is no whole lot of talking and processing things. As a matter of fact, it's really the complete opposite, and it becomes very difficult. Even in friendships, you know what I mean? Not just any relationships, you know what I mean? And I think a lot of it has to do with how we see ourselves, you know what I mean?
It's interesting that you say that because, I can relate to the thing that you said, that for me, the hardest part of my transition has been, connecting and intimacy and, intimate relationships with women. I've had some pretty bad experiences transitioning home. And I think, at first you start to wonder, what's wrong with this person? What's wrong with this person that I'm seeing? But you just said a really pivotal part of it, which is I've had to recently, now 2.5 years out, start asking myself, what is it in me? Right. And it's not something that you get to process while you're in prison, the complete lack of, that type of connection, because it's just part of your everyday life, right? You lock in your cell and, you don't have somebody to unpack that with and talk to and connect with. I think about the experience in visits, the one chance that you get to experience that connection and that romance or intimacy with a partner, and how even that's policed, right? And you go into it with fear and anxiety, when if I'm with somebody while I'm in prison, if I'm married or I had a girlfriend when I went in, or I find that intimate partnership while I'm in through connecting with somebody from my past or whatever the case may be, you go into the visit room and there's literally officers watching every move. And am I going to hug this person too long? If I'm allowed to kiss them, is my kiss going to be too aggressive, or is it going to be 1 second too long? And then I'm going to get punished for that and end up staying in prison for an extra week because I made out with my girl for longer than I was allowed to. Or if I hold her hands across the table, are they going to think I'm passing something? And, are they going to run down? Am I going to get put in a solitary confinement cell for a week while they wait for me to go to the bathroom so they can sift through my poop, right? All of these really oppressive things happen to you in your sense of relationships while you're on the inside. And then you transition home and everything's just supposed to be normal, right? You're not supposed to have anxiety about acts of intimacy and hugging and kissing and holding hands. Like, I didn't get to do those things for 13 years. And for me, it's like, I want it so bad. Like, I crave it. My body, my heart craves it. But then it's like almost like the process of vetting people has become really hard for me. Like, you want to believe in people. Like, you meet somebody, you click with them, and you want to believe, like, oh man, for me at least, this is the thing that I was missing for 13 years that I dreamt about, that I wanted so bad. And it doesn't always work out good. And so I've had to ask myself lately, like, what is it in me that makes it really hard to have a healthy relationship? Because I feel like I'm trying all the right things. I feel like I show up the way that I've always wanted to show up while I was in prison. And I thought about, who am I going to be as like a boyfriend or a husband or a father? You know, I really bring all those things to every interaction that I have when I feel like I found somebody that I connect to. But I do suffer from the same thing that you do, like that lack of trust, that lack of, even for me, like confidence sometimes, because the couple of times that I found some type of partnership when I was in prison with somebody on the outside, it's like I was just abandoned, you know, and my physical presence was never, they were never going to be able to get over that no matter how hard I tried. And I just don't think it's something that people really wrap their mind around, how traumatizing that isolation can be when you're in prison.
Well, it's not only the isolation, but we become we become codependent by almost by default in a lot of ways, right? Because everything that we're doing while we're in prison is you're dependent on everything. You know what I'm saying? We're dependent on the system to feed you and open the door and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But we're also dependent on our family that's in there. And a lot of people that I see coming out, they're upset, like, oh, you weren't there for me while I was in. You know, they say that's a pretty common thing that happens. Like, you know what I mean? You find out who your friends are when you're locked up. You know what I mean? That's a very, it's a pretty common statement across the board. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But more importantly, Brad, I think the self-esteem is really the issue, right? Like, because for the most part, we are, you know, we have this inflated sort of ego, right? Because we're coming out of this system of aggression, right? And part of like being incarcerated, like we're seeing, we play it out like, oh, I was just in prison, so I can have sex with all these people, right? Like that's the way our brain is thinking, and we're not really necessarily like, I want to get to know somebody, I want to have sex, right? Is two different things, you know what I mean? And so and then once somebody in the community is like, you have sex and you hook up with them, right? Well, they're looking for something a little different than what our expectations are,
Yeah.
or really, or what we can really provide, right? So we have an inflated ego, right, and a deflated self-esteem, right? So lots of times we put ourselves out there to do things, and we don't have like enough self-confidence in there to actually give ourselves up to somebody else. You know what I mean?
It's such an interesting thing to think about, like, because in a lot of ways, those things seem like they can't exist, that inflated ego and that deflated self-esteem, because I think at a basic level, we believe that, like, ego requires self-esteem, but I think that you're really framing that in such an important way, because it's true. Like, you come out with this ego, like, oh, I've been locked up for so long, I haven't had any, you know, intimate contact, and like newsflash for anybody who's listening, maybe it's not this way for everybody, but like, that's a natural thing to want.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
We're human beings. We're programmed to seek out, you know, pleasure and intimacy and these things. And, you know, like, you hit puberty and then you're like, this is all science in a lot of ways. And you think that, like, having that ego would mean that you have a ton of self-esteem, but it's not how it works necessarily. And I think when I hear you talk about that, another thing that really comes up for me is, like, I remember what it was like coming home, and, you know, like, there was definitely times, and even still, like 2.5 years later, where I'm like, I don't want the intimacy, I just want the physical, right? I don't want the relationship, I just want that, like, exchange of like, I just want to feel good sometimes because I spent so long not feeling good. But then I find myself realizing that I've been in situations where it's like, that's what my mind is telling me that I want. But I also really want the comfort of like having somebody who's there and the physical presence and the company and like,
Yeah, the real problem though is that that's our need, right? That's our need.
yeah,
It's not that other person's need,
for sure.
right? Lots of times we end up saying and doing things that we don't actually mean to fill that need that we have inside ourselves, right? So if we start doing stuff like that now, relationships are not built on trust, right? It's not about trust. It's about getting our needs met. And that's how we've been living our lives for a really long time, is just about getting our individual need met all the time. So relationships become very like communicating about like what's really going on with us. We've been programmed to not do that for so long, right? That's a sign of weakness almost, right? Like to talk about my feelings and tell somebody that like you hurt me, and do it in a way that's like pro-social and like is going to develop a relationship is a lot more difficult than just cutting people off, because that's how I used to do it. I would just cut you off. I'm never talking to you again if you cross, because most of the people that are coming out of the system are pretty principled people. And you live by a certain set of rules almost in your own head, and then you expect everybody else in the community to
understand
to expect those same principles that we've been living by. And it's like, it's not the way it works, man. And I have to be aware of other people, more important, like, because if I'm just trying to fill that need that you're talking about, I just want to feel good. That's all cool, but what comes with that, you know what I mean? Yeah. That we forget all about that, because then it becomes, I need that, but then once that's not happening, I'm going to go off and do my thing over here, and that person is over there suffering, going, what are you doing to me? You know what I mean? Why are you?
And then there's that next barrier, which is like, even when you work at your communication and when you work at like your vulnerability and your honesty, because I've been here before too, where like I do consider myself a high level communicator. I do consider myself somebody who's pretty upfront and pretty honest with people. And when I try to explain to somebody that I'm having intimacy with where I'm coming from and why I still have more emotional work to do in order to be able to have that, like to reinflate my self-confidence and to learn to trust and establish those dynamics that are really important in a relationship, it's like I start to feel hopeless sometimes. I'm like, how can I describe to somebody something that's so impossible for me to even understand about myself, right? And then we cut through the other layers of like the abandonment issues that a lot of us
that's
have.
really at the crux of it, Brandon, is really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with abandonment that happened long before we were incarcerated.
Yeah, and then
I'm dealing with this little boy inside me all the time that screams out, that starts to take control of my life sometimes. When I'm having a temper tantrum, you hurt me for this particular reason, it's because this little kid inside me is crying out, and I have to, eventually we have to teach ourselves to be an adult in that moment, right? That I have to take control. I have to take this little kid's hand and go, no, it's going to be okay, Jeremy. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I got this, just relax. Yeah. And the problem is that not everybody recognizes that process is happening. And so like, when we get into these relationships with our significant others or this or that, that little kid is driving the relationship, because I'm scared of getting abandoned. I'm scared of, you know what I'm saying? I'm scared of being alone, because there's nothing more lonely than that door closing on us at night, and we're stuck in those things. And then when we get out here, well, finally I have something. I have these relationships. People care about me. And now what becomes our biggest fear is them leaving us again.
And then a lot of times we self-sabotage, right? Like we leave, or we make it impossible for somebody to stick around because we're so afraid. And like, this is not unique to people in prison. I mean, this is a common thing in society anyways, in relationships, and a lot of relationships turn unhealthy because of some of those.
The layer to people that's the incarcerated piece is that we spent years not trusting, like the level of paranoia that I've seen with men and women coming out to other people is it definitely adds another dimension to unhealthy relationships. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things too that like when you're inside, you learn certain tactics and certain norms that just become part of your everyday life. Like you have to manipulate when you're in prison. Even if you're doing it for all the right reasons, you have to manipulate. I remember times where I had to manipulate the officer working my pod just so I could get to education, right? And every time I would be like, why is the system like this? Why do I have to tell a person a lie to get my education? Why do I have to manipulate people in my surrounding to just have some type of like peace and quiet? And you learn these things that you then carry into your relationships. You have to deprogram yourself from them. And it's super unhealthy when you take prison norms into intimate relationships, because even though some of the things that we experience are common for a lot of people in society, the way that we've experienced them and the frequency that we've experienced them is so much more in a lot of ways, right? So I think about like my fear of people leaving 100% also comes from the abandonment issues I have when I was a child, right? And the fact that my mom wasn't there, and the fact that, you know, so many people came and went in my life, and I moved almost every year of my life, and I never had a community. I never had anybody stick around. Then I go to prison and I experience people dropping off for the entire 13 years, and you establish a relationship year 8, you reconnect with somebody, and then year 9, they've got a boyfriend, and all of a sudden you're not good enough to even be their friend because there's jealousy and all of these layers of abandonment I carried out with me.
Oh, yeah.
And I have a really hard time like believing in people. And then to make matters worse, I found myself in a couple unhealthy relationships where I tried to really overcome those fears and overcome those anxieties and, you know, get to the point where I was communicating and vulnerable with like what I had been through and why it was, you know, hard to connect. And then it chipped away even more because I was like, man, now I'm finally home and I'm still never going to find these things and people are still going to hurt me and abandon me. But like what I really want people to understand that are listening in is like the system does this to us. It's such a flaw in our system of incarceration, right? Like, okay, you want to believe that somebody makes a mistake and has to experience punishment, and that anything that happens to them when they're in prison is just like, it's just desserts, right? Like, this is what you deserve. If you can't do the crime, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. But like when we really start unpacking the layers of how traumatizing and unhealthy our system is and what it does to people, when we talk about intimate relationships, and when we talk about connection and all these things, like, I don't know that anybody deserves to be completely isolated from the possibility of connecting with somebody. I don't know that anybody deserves to be completely cut off from intimacy, something that every human being desires. We're made to be in community with one another. We're made to experience, you know, differing levels of intimacy, from family to romance to friendship. And we put people in a system that completely destroys every possibility of having any form of intimacy in your life. And that's not something you can teach somebody when they're coming home. You can't have a re-entry class on how to be intimate. Like, that requires, especially with what you're talking about and all the different layers and the traumas and the complexities, that requires like intense therapy. And most people coming home don't have the means to engage in that, so they just have to figure it out. And we wonder why the majority of men and women who go back to prison after being released go back for domestic related things. And maybe it's not violence. Maybe it's, I started using drugs because my relationship's working out, or, you know, maybe it is domestic violence.
There is a lot of domestic violence that happens, and I think it's you know, I can relate to this being super like like I've had this overwhelming sense of jealousy, and I have, you know, through my own work, I understand what it is. It's really driven by this fear, right? Of like losing something that's mine. You know what I mean? And you know, that's the same mentality I had around the state toothbrush that I had.
Yeah.
Like, that's mine. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's mine, and I have to have it. I need it. You know what I mean? And that's the mentality that a lot of people that are coming out have, and it creates a lot of really lot of unhealthy situations.
And how many unhealthy relationships did you see in prison when people would have, when they would come in with a girlfriend, or they would have
call it phone beard. You got the phone beard. You got a guy over there just on the phone all the time,
and that possession,
right in the phone. Yeah,
and it's wild for you to bring that up, because like I can remember times when I was in prison when like I misplaced my spork, And I was like ready to go cell to cell and stab somebody if I had to, because I thought somebody stole my spork, my state-issued spork.
It's this principle of the sport being gone, and then it becomes the principle of, hey, this person's talking to my, you know what I mean? Like it's not based in reality. It's based in fear, right?
And then that inflated ego just propels that sense of like, this is mine, right? Like, so I would watch guys in relationships, and I would just wonder how the women would endure all of that jealousy and that possessiveness and the threats and everything. But also I'd wonder, why does this person feel so hyper-focused on controlling things that they literally can't control from inside of those walls and those fences and those cells? But you're 100% right. I just come back to this, that inflated ego, right? Like, I have to use all of these tactics to try to hold on to something that's mine in this relationship. But also that inflated ego is feeding the sense of like, how scary it would be to lose that sense of connection and that resemblance of intimacy, even if it just exists on the phone. Like when somebody tells me on the phone, I love you and I'm waiting for you and I miss you, how scary it must be to imagine losing that and then confront the isolation that you haven't experienced in its totality because you've had that partnership.
And especially when you develop this innate sense of like violence, because you're in this environment where, you know, somebody cuts you, you know, there's always this, I'm going to beat you up type of, you know what I mean? That's your reaction when somebody, you know, takes your sport, right?
Aggression becomes transactional.
Right, it becomes, you do this to me, now I have to do this to you.
Or I have to have the threat of doing this to you so that you know not to do it to me again, because what if my threat is real?
And people carry that mentality into these relationships, into the relationship. If you do this, you know what I mean? And this is where the development of the domestic violence starts to happen. You know what I mean?
It's just, you know, it's just like one of these things, the more that we're talking about it, I'm realizing that I think we really are going to have to spend, you know, a handful of episodes really unpacking this and talking.
Well, it's really and really what it comes down to, we're really talking about communication, right? Advocating for yourself and finding yourself in the right situations by being able to like express your feelings in a meaningful way, right? And this isn't just about intimate relationships. This is friendships. This is business. This is our career. This is the, you know, going to the coffee shop down the street. You know what I mean? I don't know how many times early on, like there would be a situation that, like the you know, as an example, the people makes the coffee wrong at the coffee shop, right? Well, instead of just saying, hey, could you make me another coffee? You know, we blow up and you know, it's a big problem because you didn't make my coffee right.
Yeah.
Well, I've just damaged this relationship, and I'll just walk away. I'm not going back into that coffee shop anymore because you made my coffee wrong, and you didn't make it right the way I wanted you to. So I'm not going back in there. Well, that's a damaging relationship in our community, right?
Yeah.
And that's the time, like, but the inflated sense of ego is gonna go, don't go back in there. You know what I mean? Like they did you wrong, you know.
And if that's how I respond when my taste buds are dissatisfied, imagine how much more dramatic the response is going to be when my heart is dissatisfied in an intimate relationship. And imagine how much more I'm going to feel is at stake, or how much more hurt I'm going to feel or wronged I'm going to feel. And so my reaction is going to be even significantly more damaging than the one at the coffee shop where my taste buds just were dissatisfied. Right. And I think that's something that, like, I think hearing you phrase it that way is important for people, because, like, it's true, right? Our heart spends so much time in prison just feeling like there's this dark cloud over it, and we have to protect, and it's almost like we have to keep the dark cloud over it while we're in prison, because if we allow any sunlight to come through and shine on my heart while I'm in prison, well, the next time that dark cloud comes, it's going to hurt even more. So I'm just going to keep it there and get used to it. And then you come out here and you engage in all the things that you were missing, and they start to feel good. And sex feels good, and intimacy feels good. And like when somebody rubs my shoulders or scratches my back, it feels good. And then I, you know, kind of mistake that for this really big thing because it was absent from my life for so long. And then I'm in an unhealthy relationship because it feels so good in the moment, even though the 99% of the time that we're not in those intimate moments, it might feel like shit. And so then I use my tactics that you just talked about from the coffee shop, where when I feel like somebody's hurting me or I can't trust them, I lash out and my words are harsh and my actions are harsh. And this is what we learned while we were in prison. I mean, there's a whole slew of things that we learned, like that come out with us and we don't choose them to come out. I'll tell you one of the oddest things for me that I've experienced, like talking about intimate relationships, and I feel extremely uncomfortable being naked, right? Like, and I laugh at it sometimes. It's funny, right? And when
I don't, man. I love being naked.
I love being naked when nobody's around. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'll walk around my place naked all the time. It feels super freeing. But like, if I'm in an intimate relationship, I spent 13 years of my life being afraid of being nude, because if the CO walks by my cell and I'm naked, or I'm peeing and my body's turned too much to their liking to the door, I can literally lose my freedom for that. I get written up for it. If I wanted to sleep naked in prison, I can't do that, because when they come for count, I have to get up and turn my light on, right? Like, all of the did you sleep naked in prison?
All the time, man. Especially the Supermax, man. It was like, what are they gonna do?
What are they gonna do?
I was sleeping.
But then it all almost becomes like a game that you're playing, right?
No.
But like,
right.
In my experience, I've tried to explain this to people. Like, I had a fear of my own body when I was in prison, because I could get in trouble. But then also, if I was told to get naked, I had no fucking choice. When I was in the visit room after a visit, I had to strip. If they thought that I was doing something, or if they were doing a shakedown, I had to strip. So I always like struggled with this irony about like my sense of my body and my nudity, and like even my own flesh being my own. And then I came home and I engaged in relationships, intimate relationships, sexual relationships. And I found myself not realizing that, like, man, I have like some weird trauma from even being naked, because of how oppressive it was when I was in prison, how at the command to get naked, I had to.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't even do it for my own, like my own purpose, right? Like, I had to be afraid of if the officer was going to do a round while I was urinating, right? I had to be afraid of if I wanted to sleep naked and a female officer came to my cell for count. Now all of a sudden I'm getting written up and I'm viewed as a predator, right? Like, these are all the intricacies of intimacy and like relationships that, like, if you're just a regular person on the outside world, how could you possibly imagine or understand what that experience is like for people in prison? And then when I talk about it in my relationships, it becomes too abstract for people to understand. And then I start to feel hopeless, because I'm like, man, I'm communicating the shit out of this. I'm being vulnerable. I'm being very honest and very open, and I still can't make this person understand why I go through some of the things I'm going through.
Yeah. This may be off color, but maybe you can use that as a help to your relationship, and maybe you could
be nude more.
No, you could just have your girlfriend just tell you when to get. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I gotta find somebody who's comfortable in doing that. Like, I find somebody who's like,
well, good luck with that, man.
Confidence, but that's also another thing that happens in prison too. Like, my view of the world
changes
and of what relationships were gonna be like.
It's supposed to be. That's why I think we do need to talk about this a lot more.
Yeah,
I think there's so many different things that aspects of this thing that you can talk about that it's important, because, like I was saying, it's in every aspect of our life. You know what I'm saying? The folks that I've been seeing that have been the most successful become good communicators, and they focus on relationships. Like, how am I going to be a better man today? And that is like, how am I going to be a better man today is like, more importantly, how am I going to be a better community member? How am I going to be a better partner? How am I going to be whatever it is, you know?
Yeah, it's wild, man. I think maybe we'll do an episode titled Megan the Stallion Syndrome, because I suffered from that when I came home from prison, right? And just like in the short context of the time we have left in this episode, like, just so everybody knows, like, Tinder didn't exist when I went to prison. Plenty of Fish didn't exist when I went to prison. Facebook dating wasn't a thing when I went to prison. People didn't meet on the internet when I went to prison. They met in person, out in the community. They ran into each other at the gym, and that's how relationships started. Online dating was a very new thing for the most part. It wasn't mainstream. And so like, that was weird for me, hearing my friends narrate their experiences of meeting their partners on online dating sites, or hearing my friends narrate their experiences of just having random hookups on online dating sites, and like that's what it's for. It's not for anything serious, and you form all these expectations. And then the female empowerment movement in hip hop happened when I was in prison. And so like I'm listening to Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B and all these female artists who are like literally talking about sex the same way male rap artists have my whole life. And I experienced this sense of like, well, I don't really have to worry about that anymore when I come home, because women are just, if a woman thinks I'm attractive and wants to sleep with me, she's just gonna roll up on me in the street and be like, yo, what's up? What's good? And that's not life. That's not reality. And so my vision of what it was like out here was so skewed that I came home. I didn't know that online dating was going to feel like a full-time job and give me extreme anxiety, right? Maintaining 10 conversations, trying to get to know somebody. When are we supposed to meet? When am I supposed to ask this? Like, and so we damage people so much when we send them to prison and isolate them from those things, because then their expectations of what's happening in the world in terms of relationships and intimacy and sex become so skewed, and they become it becomes hijacked. My sense of those things were hijacked. And then we could throw another layer on top for a whole nother episode, that I also didn't have any positive experiences with women when I was in prison, because they're trained to view you as a rapist, as an aggressor, as the enemy. So like nursing staff, female correctional officers, female volunteers, all of them look at every single person in the prison, and I'm not gonna say all of them, but a good majority of women working in male prisons look at the prisoners as if I have to be careful. I can't maintain eye contact for too long. I can't be too nice to this person because they're a monster, and who knows what they'll do to me in the broom closet if they got their chance. Like, we're not all rapists. As a matter of fact, the minority are. Like, prisons aren't full of rapists. Prisons aren't full of overly aggressive men. But what prison does is teach you to be overly aggressive and resentful of your relationships with women and the dynamics that exist in that. Whether it's the women on the outside that you're in relationship with because of that inflated ego and that sense of transactional aggression that exists in prison, or if it's your sense of like I was severely damaged by my paranoia about being seen as a weirdo or a predator by women inside of the prison who worked there. And I carry all of that baggage out with me, and I'm not really sure where to drop them off. I'm not really sure where to unzip them and start unpacking the baggage that I experienced with that. And it's such a huge topic. And I think we could get into like a lot of different things about it, like the abolishment of conjugal visits or family visits that used to be pretty commonplace in prisons across our country, and the creation of newer prisons that are more secure and that have less opportunities for community. Because Thomaston, for instance, the old Thomaston prison was way different in visits, was way different in how he experienced community compared to what the Maine State Prison, which is a state-of-the-art prison, is, right? Like, your ability to connect is way different. And so culturally, things have shifted. And then you're in prison and you experience your ideas about what's happening in the community and society when it comes to sex and relationships, just to get released and realize, like, oh my God, the music videos and the books that I read and the magazines don't actually depict reality. Super, super hard thing to come to terms with, right? Like, it's just super, man, it's interesting to think about. And then even for myself, somebody 2.5 years out, I'm a dad now, I have a daughter. I've dated casually, I've dated seriously, I've been through all these ebbs and flows of relationships since I've been out. And I still, to this very day, as we sit here, I can't figure it out. You know what I mean? I can't figure out how to kind of get over some of those traumas and some of that, the things in me that were hijacked when it comes to like relationships and intimacy, man. It's wild. So I think we will have to unpack it a couple more episodes.
Oh, sure.
Well, thanks everybody for listening to us rant and rave about this topic that, might be a little bit abstract now, but hopefully we can continue to unpack it. And I don't know, is there anything that you want to say to kind of end this episode?
No, that was a good one. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Subscribe, download, like, share, listen, watch. Behind the Door, coming at you, matching green hats. Thank you, everybody.